Thank you. My name is Julian Toilast. I'm the head of Masterplanning and Design for Quintain. It sounds like a grand title, I apologise for that. I'm an architect by training. I worked for 17 years in London for a firm of architects called Terry Farrell and Partners, and I joined Quintain in 2005, 1st of February 2005, so I'm coming up for 13 years with Quintain. I have found it absolutely fascinating learning about Wembley. I myself live in Clapham, so I'm a South Londoner, I apologise. I got my passport to come north of the river. But Wembley is one of those places that when we talk about what we are doing, if we go anywhere in the world and you say you're from London and we're working on a project in London, people know where London is. And then you say you're working on a project in Wembley and everybody all over the world has heard of Wembley. And that's quite special. You know, when you think, you know, we're out here on sort of zone 4 on the tube network. If you went around London to any other location that was that far out of London, I mean, people might have heard of Twickenham or Richmond, but Wembley's got this really special appeal to people all over the world. And something that we do quite a lot when we have people coming to visit us and for walks around the site, we'll often say to the people, well, what was the last time you were here? You know, what brought you to Wembley, or what's your memories of Wembley? And we do this with the architects we work with. And just recently, we've been working with a firm of architects, and we're looking at Olympic Way. And I won't talk too much about Olympic Way, because I know it's the subject of a talk, I think, in 2 talks' time. But when we were out around the table, one of the architects said, oh, well, I remember my dad bringing me to the 1966 World Cup final. And the principal of the practice, Jeremy Dixon and Edward Jones, said, oh, coming to the 1948 Olympics opening ceremony. So I think he's our longest memory of Wembley. But everybody's got that sort of thing. There's something etched in their mind. They can often remember the first concert they might have seen at I apologise, I'll call it Wembley Arena. I know I should call it the SSE Arena Wembley, but Empire Pool, Wembley Arena, everybody can remember the first concert they saw there. So we do think it is a place which is quite special because of these memories embedded in it. But it's also quite interesting because normally when we talk about history and heritage, it's often about the physical fabric, it's about buildings. But Wembley's got this extra dimension to it, I think. It's this sort of all the memories that people have had here as well. So I'll touch upon that a little bit as we go through. These are sort of 10 design principles that we put in all of our briefs to all of the designers working on the projects, the architects, the landscape architects, and the engineers. And there's 4 I just wanted to pick out in orange. We talk a lot about placemaking. Particularly the existing context. So, I mean, the practice I work for, Terry Farrell, you know, particularly strong on that, an understanding of history, the sense of place, genus loci is the sort of the Latin expression for it. So really getting to understand what is the place of Wembley and Wembley Park. Then there's also this interesting challenge that we set our designers, because they can go out and they can see the existing surroundings, but what's sometimes quite hard for them to understand is the emerging context that they're going to be working into. So they might be just working on one building in the whole scheme, so we have to kind of help them imagine the building that's coming along next to their plot a few years down the line. And all of that feeds into this sort of context, which is obviously physical, but there's a big social and economic context to it as well. We focus a lot on urban design, not just architecture. So it's where the streets and spaces are more important than the buildings. If you talk about places people have been to, they can often describe the streets. But for many people, they don't necessarily look above the line of the shop fronts. You know, if you showed people pictures of buildings on Oxford Street, many people might not even recognise they were on Oxford Street. But if you showed them a picture of the street itself, they would probably understand that. So urban design is as important as architecture. And then there's this transition from what we call the public realm right the way through to the private realm. So clearly at Wembley Park we're building a lot of places for people to live. They're in close proximity to streets which on occasion can be used by up to 90,000 people. So it's quite important to make people feel that they're living somewhere where they have their own sense of privacy, even if they are in close proximity to these very busy streets. We're talking a lot about the infrastructure. There's 85 acres of land that we're working on around the stadium. And by the time we've finished, a quarter of that will be publicly accessible streets and parks. All of it is actually kept clean by Quintain, so it's not cleaned by Brent, but that's sort of 25% of the land is publicly accessible, and another 25% of it is the residents' gardens and roof terraces. So that's quite a lot of the land actually is sort of space at the end of the day. And then we use this expression space positive. Perhaps going back through history, certain architects got a little bit fixated about the building as an object, and they forgot about the space around it. So the expression space positive is that you think positively about the spaces and places you are creating with the buildings that you are using to make them. Two other things. We design for longevity. So there's this expression commodity, firmness and delight. It's important to have a bit of excitement and delight in design. You have to design for weathering. Now, how many buildings have you seen where the photo taken the day after it finished looked beautiful, but 5 years later it was streaking and riddled with damp? So how the thing weathers, and then how the building is managed. So as I've mentioned, about a third of our team at Wembley Park is involved in managing the place that's being created. So that's people who look after crowd safety, it's people who look after parking, but it also includes David Hughes, who's our landscape technician. I tend to call him David the gardener, but he's the guy that makes sure that all of the planting, all of the trees is kept well maintained and again survives everything which gets thrown at it day in, day out. And then finally, sort of four principles, these defining features. Would I live there, work there, shop there, park my car there? It's a fairly simple test, but when you're designing these things, just apply that simple principle. If it's good enough for you, then it should be good enough for the people that it's being created for. But it's important. I think there's perhaps too many examples in history of architects who have designed things and then never lived in them themselves. So I think that's a good test. Will I be proud of what was achieved? That's something to me which is very personally important to me. You have to be proud of what's being done. What are the added values by what's being done? They might be environmental, they might be social, or they might be economic. And then finally, does the design activate all five senses? So we tend to focus a lot upon how things look, but it's also quite important how they sound, how they feel. If you're visually impaired, what's the touch of it? What's the aroma? So planting is quite a key thing of it. You might say, walking down Olympic Way, the lingering aroma might be fried onions or horse manure. So what's the aroma of the planting? We haven't yet done a building which is good enough to eat, but it's not inconceivable that we could do a landscape which is edible. So we've sort of thought a little bit about that. There are some risks with that, but maybe that's something that we can sort of perfect over the next few years. So I just want to try and link a couple of themes together. The idea of mapping and vistas or views. Humphry Repton. So the way I'd sum them up is that you've got Capability Brown followed by Humphry Repton. So Capability Brown, well-known landscape designer and also a contractor. Humphry Repton, the landscape designer. And he was very well known for these drawings he did. The top left-hand drawing is actually the view from the tower at Wembley. And it's sort of like a before and after image. They were called the Red Books, they were his sketchbooks. And basically the top view was his sketch of the existing view that he found, and the bottom view is how that view would look after he had done his landscape work. And he often was working for people doing large houses, stately homes, but he also talked a lot about how the combination of the landscape and the buildings could improve the sense of place. It so happens that this is the bicentenary of his death this year. Now, I didn't know that when I started putting this talk together at Christmas, but when I was researching some information on it, I thought, oh, actually, that's quite handy. So, but why is he relevant to Wembley? Well, in 1787, Richard Page decided to convert the Page family home, Wellers, into a country seat, and Page employed Humphry Repton. And that really is the start of the landscape setting that we tend to think of in and around Wembley Park. I mean, clearly going back before that, the Anglo-Saxon name, Wembersley, all that sort of stuff, but you know, we tend to think of this sort of 1792, this time when Repton started to do his work for the Page family at Wembley. Now, 1834, this map here is a little bit fuzzy, but coming basically up from the bottom of the hill here, that's roughly Wembley Hill Road. So coming up from the triangle, coming up over the hill, past the Green Man, and heading off to Harrow on the hill. But that's sort of the earliest map that we've got at the moment for the Wembley Park area. 1895, the Metropolitan Railway has come through on the top right-hand corner of the map, and the what we'd now call the Bakerloo line to Wembley Central has come through in the middle of the map. And then you can see the top right-hand side, that is Wembley Park. So the laying out of the pleasure park for Londoners that could come out from central London on the Metropolitan line, get off at Wembley Park station, and then walk down into Wembley Park. And you know, many of you will know the Tower for London, or Watkins Tower, or effectively the first third got built and then got nicknamed Watkins Folly. So 1890s, coming up to the 1900s, this is Wembley Park. It has always been a place for enjoyment and pleasure in relation to the wider area of London. Just zooming in a little bit more on that map, so Wembley Park station is here. This is coming down the hill. This is roughly where the petrol station is at the moment by McDonald's. And then coming round Park Lane, the Green Man pub is just here. And this is roughly where the axis of Olympic Way would be now, coming down to Watkins Folly on the top of the hill. There are some really interesting resources online. Now, I'm not going to try and call these up, but if ever you look up the Pathé newsreel footage, there is a wonderful piece of footage that around about the 1920s, when the decision was made to host the British Empire exhibition at Wembley Park, there was quite a lot of moving around of the trees and the landscape went on. And there's this lovely bit of footage of lots of gentlemen in flat caps and a couple of foremen wearing their trilbies, picking up some of these very large trees from Repton's Park and moving them around to create the spaces for the Empire exhibition. And as the camera pans round, you can see the old Wembley Stadium under construction on the top of the hill. So, and I'm sure all of you will know the British Empire exhibition map, you know, some absolutely sort of beautiful graphic design work to go with the buildings, and the whole arrival system for that station. I think, I'm assuming you probably know more about the British Empire exhibition than I do, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that. Stadium opens, of course, 1923, the Empire exhibition 1924. But what's quite interesting about that is that the maps and the guides that were produced for that This is the map sort of conventionally presented. The old stadiums at the bottom, the Empire Stadium at the bottom, the main route going up towards Wembley Park, Kingsway as it was then called, and then the motor park on the west side, and then the main exhibition station on the right-hand side. So all fairly familiar stuff. But you'd also get maps presented this way. And now you might say that's upside down. But if you've arrived at Wembley Park tube station, that is the way the Empire exhibition would have looked to you. It's fairly familiar now. You know, for people who have sat-nav systems in their cars, that is an option. You know, the world is presented heads up, I believe is the technical expression. So it's something that we look at in our wayfinding and mapping work at Wembley. So 1934, the Empire Pool built sort of effectively in one of the old lakes. And clearly winding that forward, when we got involved in 2004 at Wembley, so the design for the new stadium was fixed, the land around the new stadium was sold off, and Quintain effectively bought Wembley London Limited, so the company which ran the Empire Pool, the Wembley Arena, the Exhibition Centre, York House, and of course all the car parking, surface car parking around the stadium. So the Grade 2 listed Wembley Arena, the Owen Williams building, that was the first part of the scheme which was refurbished and reorientated. The front door, as many of you may remember, used to face Empire Way, so it sort of faced away from the stadium, and the east side gave out onto a sort of swimming pool, a Lido, an open-air paddling pool. So the building was not literally turned around, but the front door was made to face the stadium, and then the service yard was built on the other side. So that was the first part of the work that we got involved in. But this isn't the first master plan that's been done for Wembley. So this one's from 1974. I think it's possibly by Richard Seafoot, or Colonel Seafoot, as an architect quite familiar in the 70s. So many of these things we were familiar, the conference centre, Elvin House as was. But interestingly enough, over on the east side of the stadium, so this part here, this was going to be a container depot. So this was sort of shipping containers and moving freight around. So that never got built. But certain fragments of that part of that master plan still exist. The ramp connections coming into the stadium from the west, Royal Route, on that elevated structure, and also the ramp for pedestrians coming up over Engineers Way, but in actual fact it was really built to get you all the way across the surface car and coach parking. There'd been an accident in the coach parking a few years before, so that's when the pedway, as we now call it, was first created. And this is the aerial photo in 1974, and again, the bottom left-hand picture, the new Wembley. It's actually the old Wembley Stadium, but with some new roofs and television galleries and all that sort of stuff. So it's sort of, there's been this process of constant change here. And the drawing in the top left-hand corner, in amongst all the records we've found, this is the original drawings of that pedestrian walkway and all the sort of concrete engineers details by a firm of engineers called Pell Frischmann, who are still very much sort of around today. So there's an awful lot of knowledge and history here. And indeed, Margaret, who has been looking after York House for us for 35 years, she's been a fantastic source of information as we've looked through it. So that's sort of 1974. 1996, another famous time in the memory of Wembley. People who remember the football games inside the stadium and the songs, everything inside the stadium looks very sort of beautifully presented. But around the stadium, it was still very much this sort of sea of surface car parking and coach parking. Obviously, the Sunday market was run on the big car park in between main events. But it was sort of a fairly well-worn environment is possibly one way of describing it around the stadium. And then fragments of the Empire exhibition still left. These are kind of a couple of useful photos. That's 1996 with all the coach parking around the old stadium. And then just to compare and contrast, that's sort of how big the new stadium is in relation to that. So sometimes when people, the stadium, obviously I should point out, has nothing to do with Quintain. It was built by other people. But when people used to ask, well, wouldn't it have been nice to keep the Twin Towers? Obviously, they're roughly around about where the manager's dugout is on the side of the pitch, so that might have been a little bit inconvenient. But I think there are some fascinating fragments of the history which are still there. They're on display inside the stadium, and a couple of them we're trying to bring back into a slightly more sort of front and centre display as we move forward. 2005, I'm sure you'll all remember it, under construction. And then you could say, well, that's the map in 2007. So you've got the new stadium, you've got Wembley Arena refurbished, and sort of just large areas of surface car parking around the stadium. I'll have to declare my loyalties. I thought another interesting bit of research that the last FA Cup final to be played at Wembley was won by Chelsea, and the first one was won by Chelsea, and that's probably revealing where my football allegiances lie. Some of you might have seen this plan before. I've brought a copy of it along here, which is you might want to look at afterwards. It's actually an overlay of the British Empire exhibition plan in red onto the sort of site layout plan which is being created at the moment. And amongst other things, we find this useful for clearly, you can see where the positioning of streets like Engineers Way and Royal Route are, but also it's quite interesting to us because you can see where the old pavilion buildings were. So the Canadian Pavilion, the Australian Pavilion, and some of that we're trying to work back into the new names for the streets and the spaces and places around Wembley Park. And indeed, this is where we're currently at with street names. So anything which is in black is already registered. And we're working on some new names at the moment. We like to celebrate particularly people who've been associated with the history of Wembley Park. One particular one that interested us, in the Palace of Industries, there was the exhibition stand F205, was the first display of a new product called Plasticine, Harbert's Plasticine stand. So we have named the road that roughly runs through there Harbert Road. And interesting enough, William Harbert's great-grandson, Brett Harbert, works with us. He's our head of planning. So hopefully sometime during the course of this year, we'll have the sort of the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But yeah, sort of small world in these things. And then also the street coming off Harbert Road is Humphry Repton Lane. I have to make a confession here. I approved the artwork. I checked these things really carefully, and Naomi kindly showed me the photo of the proudly installed street name. And I do apologise. We spelt Humphrey's name wrong. We put an E in it by mistake. We are getting that corrected. So I do apologise for that. But again, it's important to celebrate these things in it. And then these are our maps. So these are the maps. If you go around Wembley Park now, you'll find these maps on the wayfinding totems. We've tried to make them very similar to the legible London maps. And again, we follow that same principle. So sometimes if you're walking up Olympic Way to the station, you'll find the map that way up. And if you're walking down Olympic Way, it will be upside down. But that's the way it looks in front of you. And we've just found that's quite a useful way of helping to orientate people. So this is our upside down placemaking map. You have this journey to the stadium. Coming off to the right, you've got the new civic centre, the sort of the more cultural area. You've got the offices and the shops, and then on the east side or the left-hand side, that's where we're creating this new 7-acre park. So about half of that park is now under construction. That's sort of roughly where the Sunday market used to be. and then the other half will be built on the northern side of Engineers Way, roughly where Wembley Retail Park used to be. So this is the overall plan. So this is from the triangle in the bottom left to Wembley Park Station in the top, and then all the way down to IKEA and Tesco's. It's just the coloured bits that we're involved in, but we sometimes think it's quite important to sort of explain this full area, because we're trying to make a place which is 365 days a year, but of course we have to recognise that for 35 or maybe 75 days a year, if Spurs are here, there's a lot more people coming to the area. So obviously one of the particular things, Wembley is fantastically well served with public transport, but there are people who still drive in, so those vehicles coming in from the North Circular Road, how they come into the whole area and how they leave is, I'm sure, the subject of much debate and many opinions. Right. So we work with, I think we've got 14 different architects working on the project at the moment and 7 different landscape architects. There are various tricks which Repton use, this idea of what's called the burrowed landscape. So if you were sitting in your house and you looked out into your garden, and your garden appeared to carry on into the fields beyond. Capability Brown did the same sort of trick. So we've used that in the building we have just recently finished, just north and west of the Civic Centre, where from the residence garden, which is the picture on the right-hand side, you look out over the Paul Daisley garden next to the Civic Centre. So that device of what's called the burrowed landscape, it sort of almost feels like your garden is twice as big because you have this uninterrupted view to the buildings beyond. Repton liked to juxtapose natural elements with formal elements, and that's possibly where he's slightly different from Capability Brown. Capability Brown tended to make the natural landscape come very much up to the house. Repton reintroduced the notion of a sort of formal landscape garden immediately adjacent to the house. And this picture is taken inside the building we completed last year, Emerald Gardens. So this is just immediately north of Wembley Arena, and that is a real photo. It's not a computer-generated image. So this is 7 buildings around a shared residence garden, and everybody who lives in any of those buildings, irrespective of whether you own the flat, rent the flat, all have access to that shared garden in the middle. And then as you move over to the east side of the stadium, to the new park, again, a number of principles from Repton's work brought into that. But interestingly, the tree planting looks at this idea of clumps and clusters of similar species of trees, and we're also trying to introduce some pine trees back into the planting as well. Pinetum is the technical expression, as part of that tree planting. And a lot of these trees are already now, we call it, we tag them. They're tagged, they're lifted, they're sitting in air pots ready to be planted, and the first of these will appear this year. It's probably about a year and a half before the park actually starts to open up, but the idea is the trees then get a chance to settle in and bed in. You'll see over the coming months the tree planting on Olympic Way will start as well, and I'll explain a little bit more of that in a minute. But the land falls away from the stadium, and Engineers Way sits slightly below the level of that park. So we've sort of again pinched another Capability Brown Repton idea. It's what's called the ha-ha. Again, as you looked out from your garden, there was effectively like a drop down a wall, so that it stopped all the cows coming into your garden. So we've worked out that if you're sitting in the new park on the grass looking northwards, you won't actually see the cars passing along Engineers Way. You'll see the buses because they're obviously a bit taller, but it's just to try and give this sense of the park joining up as one park. So one might say there's nothing new in design. It's all reinterpreted ideas from the past. And then this is a view looking into the park. So the stadium's sort of just off the top of the picture. Quite a substantial amount of water brought into that. Some of the water is deliberately designed so it's safe for children to paddle in and play in, and others is perhaps more ornamental. And then all of this can be designed so that you could do events in this park, but they're not stadium events. These are Wembley Park events, so concerts, smaller scale concerts. There's enough space for big concerts inside the stadium or inside the arena, but it's actually trying to find this sort of small and medium scale events as well, which we think would work quite well. Olympic Way, Kingsway, as it was originally known by many as Wembley Way, but of course Wembley Way is technically a small street in Tockington. 1948, the view down Olympic Way, as it then became, and we particularly like the picture of the AA man on the left-hand side there, fixing up the sort of street signs. So my colleagues set me up a few years ago and got me to sort of recreate the pose. But again, this sort of before and after is something that we're quite keen on. 1955, England 7, Scotland 2. Lots of gentlemen in trilby hats leaving the stadium. The final in 1966, coaches and cars driving down Olympic Way, driving into the surface car park, and you can see in the foreground the mix of pedestrians and traffic. And it's not giving away any secrets, but obviously we have to think even more carefully now about the mix between vehicles and crowds of people in crowded places. It's a sad reality of life, but we have to think quite carefully about that in the work we do. 1971, for Arsenal fans in the audience, I'm sure you'll remember Charlie George's goal, but that's the youngsters leaving after the event. And then Chelsea don't always win at Wembley. This is very dejected Chelsea fans leaving after losing to Man United in 1994. I think sort of the Wembley Olympic Way, it's had a lot of foot traffic over the years, and for those that have been to Wembley Park recently, you've probably seen the changes which we've already started to make. So this is looking from Bobby Moore Bridge, looking down towards the stadium. And this is the gradual process we're doing. So it's repaving it, relighting it, and putting in a new sort of scale of lampposts and banners. So if you think of the Mall leading up to Buckingham Palace, when there's a state visit on, it's bedecked with sort of Union flags and the flags of the visiting premier. To us, in some ways, sort of Olympic Way has that sort of feel. It is a street of celebration, but it is also an everyday street as well. So we're trying to get that sort of scale right. And as you walk down Olympic Way, you come to Fulton Road. It's always been a bit sort of, unclear about pedestrians and vehicle priorities. So we're installing new signal crossings and everything like that on there. So again, this sort of idea of this sort of grand ceremonial route taking you down towards the stadium. So this work is underway now and will be completed in 3 phases over the next few years. Some recent aerial photographs. You might have noticed that the rate of construction has significantly increased perhaps in the last couple of years. So the big green car park where the Sunday market was, a year ago that was still tarmac, and now it's one big building site with the park under construction. So things have speeded up. And I think one of the things that's now in our minds is that the stadium recently announced that it's holding the Champions, the Euro 2020 finals here. So again, it's important to think about how the whole environment around Wembley Stadium, Wembley Arena, Wembley Park will look for that worldwide TV audience in 2020. Last 2 slides. I just thought it was quite interesting. When you look back to that image there of the view of the hill, so Watkins Folly has just been removed. They're just starting to lay out the old footprint for the old stadium, and then sort of from the same angle where we are this time this year. There's one sort of final view that, again, it's on the internet. This just shows some time-lapse photography of what's been going on over the last few years. hope that's given you some idea of the way we try and approach the work we're doing at Wembley Park. As I say, I think there are so many rich sort of seams of the heritage which can be explored here, and I think it's really important to make sure that continues to be communicated and passed on to sort of the next generation of people who are going to visit and live at Wembley Park. So thank you for your time. So thank you for your time.